on the deliberations for the annual plan. So welcome to you. We are being live streamed, so if you could please pull your microphone into you when you speak so that everybody listening from afar can hear what is being said. So to those who are watching and listening from afar, no mai haramai, welcome to our meeting this morning. Mobile phones, please, if you could just turn them off and put out of sight, and but we will be taking breaks so that you can check for urgent messages. So at this point, I would like to ask Ms. Marks if you can open, please, with our karakia this morning. Thank you.
Tēnā koe, Madam Chair. Nā mihi nui kia koutou katoa I tēnei wai, tēnei hui o te tau. Kia ora, if you know this karakia, feel free to join along with me. Kia inui tātou. Whakataka te hau ki te uru, whakataka te hau ki te tonga. Kia mā kina kina ki uta, kia mā taratara ki tai. E hi ake ana te atākura, e tio, he huka, he hauhu, ti hei, mauri ora.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Apologies, please. I do have an apology today from Councillor Tapsell. So are there any apologies, any other?
Apologies, Madam Chair, from Mr. Berryman Camp today.
Mr. Berryman Camp, thank you. Anybody leaving early or anything? No? Thank you. Could I please have a mover and a seconder that our apologies be accepted? Thank you, Mrs. Trumper. Thank you, Your Worship. All those in favour, please say aye. Thank you. Carried. Any items of urgent business? I do have an item of urgent business that I would like to put to the meeting this morning. There was quite some comment and feedback on the decision that was made at our meeting last week. It was a little around from councillors, the predetermination. Oh, well, actually, it was around good decision making and good governance. Really, that was it. And councillors were somewhat unclear about what predetermination was about an open mind. And as you know, I didn't allow questions from one of our councillors. So there was quite some concern and feedback that I've received. So I would like to ask Jeff, thank you, Jeff, if you could just clarify that, because I'd like to start this meeting off in the way that we'd like to proceed, in a good way. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Through the Chair, Morena koutou. Committee members, you will recall that at a last meeting I provided advice on matters of predetermination. It's somewhat disappointing to me to note that subsequently such advice has actually been perceived or presented as somehow being politically motivated. This is quite untrue. Again, this is quite untrue. Instead, my motivation is to ensure that our council operates according to the best decision-making parameters possible, and also operates in a way that reflects good governance for this organisation. It is important that you receive advice and that you see that it is independent. So to that end, I have arranged for Kate Corniget to appear before you this morning. Kate is the writer of the independent legal advice and is a senior member of Tompkins Waite law firm, therefore completely independent. So if Kate, you could come to the front table. What I've asked through the chair is for Kate to give a brief overview as to the advice provided, and then to provide an opportunity for you to ask her any questions or any points of clarification that you may need.
Thank you, Jeff. Good morning, Kate. Thank you for coming along this morning.
Good morning, Madam Chair. Kia ora koutou. I understand that all elected members have seen the legal advice that has been circulated, and so I'm here just to talk to the general outline of that, with particular focus on the issues that are relevant to the annual plan deliberations that are taking place today. In the summary of our advice, what we've been clear about is that there is a line between an elected member's ability to speak confidently, forthrightly, and publicly on a matter and to hold strong opinions, and the circumstances that will lead to a suggestion that an elected member has predetermined the outcome of a decision in a way that creates legal risk for council. Councillors, as political participants, are entitled to hold strong views, to express those views publicly, and to participate in public debate and council debate, sharing those views. But it's very important that all councillors participating in a final decision on a proposal bring an open mind to that process. What that means is that each councillor must be prepared, despite their predispositions, honestly to consider whether they should change their mind based on the evidence that's put before them. What's clear from the legal authorities where a non-financial interest is at issue is that there needs to be actual predetermination, provided that council is making decisions in an administrative capacity rather than an adjudicative capacity. So I'm focusing here on the sorts of decisions that council is making in this context, where decisions are being made for the wider community about issues that impact everyone, rather than determining issues that affect only two or slightly more private parties. The risks are slightly different in the latter category of decisions, where a risk of apparent bias would be sufficient to challenge a decision. So where the decision is not adjudicative, it is necessary for any judicial review of the decision that actual predetermination be established. And actual predetermination does set a high threshold, and the courts have been consistently clear about that. So as I've said previously, the mere expression of views won't be taken to be predetermination unless there is something in the members' conduct that suggests they truly do not bring an open mind to decision making. In the context of the issues at hand, we've considered the position where elected members are appearing as submitter as well as voting on the matter. In those situations, there's no specific legal authority that we've been able to identify in recent New Zealand cases, but based on the Office of the Auditor General's advice, our view is that it is not possible to make or not generally going to be possible to make a submission and to bring an open mind to the decision. And that's because it is generally going to be unrealistic to expect that somebody who has set out their position formally and for the contemplation of the other elected members will genuinely be bringing an open mind to the decision making. I want to be clear that the actual decision of a court in any situation would depend on an analysis of all the facts, and that would include the participation of any elected member in any deliberations and what their behaviour in those deliberations indicated about their predispositions or predeterminations. It would also depend, or the outcome would also depend, on whether an affected member's position influenced the final outcome of the decision. So the things that a court would be looking at will vary depending on whether that member's decision, that member voted in favour or with the majority, whether they were in a minority, and also whether their participation in the debate indicated that other members may have been influenced by a predetermined view. So all of those factors would be relevant to a court considering an actual application for judicial review. Our advice to Rotorua Lakes Council as the council organisation is based on factors that increase the risk to council and the risk in a loss of public acceptance of its decision-making processes, and that create, I guess, an environment where a judicial review would be more likely to happen and would be more likely, if it happened, to be successful or to need serious legal resources to defend. And it's that environment that we've considered the issue of elected members making submissions on matters that are before the elected members. And in our view, in general, where an elected member has made a submission, that submission will be indicative of a final concluded view of the matter, even where it has been expressed in qualified or caveated terms. It will generally be unrealistic to think that a member will vote against their own clear, formal views. We've also considered the position where a submission is made on behalf of a group in which an elected member has an interest. And in that case, again, it will be a question of fact in all the circumstances whether the member or members in question have supported or aligned themselves with the submission, whether they've participated in it, and whether they can genuinely hand to heart say that they have not predetermined the question before them. We do not consider that withdrawal of a submission that's been made would necessarily be sufficient to cure any suggestion of predetermination unless it's patently clear that the withdrawal was due to a genuinely open mind rather than due to a desire to participate and not prevent oneself from participating in decision making. So I'm not saying that it's absolutely impossible for these things to happen, but in general, the person wearing two hats as submitter and decision maker is going to create a much higher risk of a suggestion of predetermination than simply public comments, public participation in public meetings, or participation in public debates. The question of what to do with if an elected member has decided that they do have predetermination is a question for that member principally, or the courts. And to be clear, I'm here in my capacity as council's lawyer and giving advice that is about managing risk for the organisation in relation to decision-making processes. Elected members may wish to take their own independent advice, but the general advice that we give is that where something exists that materially increases the risk of a predetermination finding, the only way for the council to protect itself against criticism or review on that ground is for the affected member to withdraw from participation in the decision making. If the decision is, in general, if it's a public decision, it's sufficient to move away from the table but to remain in the room. But if a decision isn't being made in public excluded, it may often be appropriate to be entirely out of the room. And it's important that it's removal from participation as well as from voting, because somebody with a predetermined view can't participate genuinely in debate and form part of the good decision making that's expected of elected members.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you. And I am pleased that we're having this, we heard you speak, Kate, in open session this morning, because it has actually raised some concern in the community about the risk that are we undertaking an open and fair process. So I think that is really important that we've had people listening from afar, and we also have the press here today, so that your view, because we do want to have good open debate, obviously, when we're deliberating, but we want to know really what a predetermination actually is. And for those councillors that raised it with me, thank you for that, and we're pleased to have had that, your views expressed this morning. I'd like perhaps Councillor McPherson, you've heard the view that's been expressed. Would you like to, if there's anything you'd like to add, you're most welcome. I'd like to give you the first opportunity.
I would like to, through you, Chair, express my reluctance to participate any further in a discussion at this table. It constitutes, in my view, an ongoing kangaroo court attempted to suppress my views. Councillor Maxwell, you'll have an opportunity to speak. You'll have an opportunity to speak after this. You'd do well to listen for a change. The point...
let's just... We'll just be respectful of everybody at the table, please. Thank you.
Right, well, this is the second time that I've endured this, what approaches to me of being a kangaroo court. The hypothetical situation behind this advice, the basis of advice, is that a member supportive of a actual decision would challenge a member of a minority of predetermination. That's extremely unlikely. This is a bizarre hypothetical, but it's the basis of the advice, which I've read many times, and I trust others have read it as well, because not only is this extremely unlikely, but it's being deployed to threaten an ongoing and open appreciation of alternatives to the predetermined position being presented by officials in the particular case we're talking about. The advice threatens the human rights to freedom of expression.
You need to modify your language, please. In terms of threaten, that's not the case.
In my view, this advice potentially undermines the human right of freedom of expression and to the principles of elected representation. And I'll leave things there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm going to open it up to members of the committee in case they'd like to perhaps have a comment after what you've heard. Oh, sorry. Questions of Kate. Oh, for Kate. And the questions are directed to Kate, just to clarify anything that you may have heard so far. Thank you, Mrs. Trumper.
Thank you. Kate, I just wanted to ask, how many cases have there been in this sort of situation where a councillor has submitted and then sat at the deliberations and at the decision table that has actually gone to court for case studies? Because my understanding is that there's been, very few, and I just really want to establish that it's really a moral and an ethical sort of situation that we're sitting in.
That's correct. At least there have been very few. There have been, I guess, several predetermination cases go through the New Zealand courts over any period of time. I've advised on challenges to decision making for other elected bodies on the basis of predetermination, but it is relatively rare that they actually get through to the final stage of the courts. They're more likely to focus on situations where somebody either has an actual interest in a personal interest in the decision being made, or has made public statements as part of a campaign or outside a campaign about a decision that's going to be made. So that's the most common environment where we see these come up. I think that's partly because it is relatively rare in my experience for a councillor to wear both hats and to refuse to, or to decide not to withdraw from decision making. I'm aware that it does happen. I don't have empirical data on it, and I don't think there is any. But it is partly because it's rare that it's not the decision that comes before the courts. There is some precedent for councillors making submissions and withdrawing from decision making, and from councillors who have other potential predetermination factors also withdrawing from decision making. Another example that I've come across recently from the Auditor General is the situation where somebody who had senior involvement in a group that was making submissions relinquished that involvement before becoming an elected member, and there were still questions as to whether that prior involvement was sufficient to create a conflict of interest. But it is primarily going to be a moral and ethical issue for each councillor to consider on their own part. And on that point, I wanted to make a couple more points that came out of the conversation we've had so far. The first is to be very clear that it's unusual for me as a lawyer to be talking about my advice in a public setting, and that we are not trying to predict the outcome of any particular court proceedings about these issues that are here today. The other is that as council's legal advisors, we can't preempt the outcome of a vote in giving advice about the risks that a particular member's conduct would create, and so we can't say, well, it doesn't matter, it's going to be a minority, because we do not know the outcome of any vote until it's happened, and because any court's going to be considering the totality of the evidence and not simply what's happened right now.
Thank you. Are there any further questions for Katie? Thank you, Your Worship.
Thank you for the clarity, Kate. The bit that I'm a bit confused about, would it have been easier if the individual hadn't presented the submission but somebody else from that group had on their behalf? Is that what's got us into this position?
This council and other councils have faced similar issues where there's been a group even without as much individual involvement. So it does still present a risk. The case I mentioned previously, the elected member in that case had taken very significant steps to disassociate herself from the group before taking office, and that would be the more prudent approach to take. But the less involvement an elected member has in the submission, the easier it is for the elected member to say, yes, I generally share the views of that group, but no, I have not made up my mind on that particular issue. And one of the factors that would be relevant would be what level of buy-in was required by members before the group would make a submission, and what that group's objects or constitution required of its members in terms of how they conduct themselves and how they make decisions.
Thank you. Councillor Donaldson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Through you, Kate. Just addressing the slightly offensive slur that this is somehow a kangaroo court, because I know you're not making a ruling here. But just I'd ask your advice regarding any decision to participate or not. Does that sit with the member themselves, or does that sit with the chair to make a ruling of? Are you able to answer that?
Yes, it sits with the member.
Thank you. I'm happy to now open it up for any comments that any councillors or committee members may have. Those questions were directed to Kate around the legal advice that was given, but if there are any comments from any councillors, I'm happy to take those now. Mr. Thomas.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Look, I just view the situation as have been addressed many times by the community boards and Te Tātou Aotearoa, and not just the elected member who sits at this table putting in a submission in those situations. Our board has had many discussions with staff over the years on this issue about even down to the point of whether I could recuse myself from any submission that the board wanted to make. We have always decided that if the board put in a submission, even if it was under the name of someone else, that I would need to step away from the table. And I would like to say that we see this as a very serious issue about whether you have the predetermined interest, so that we actually debate this as a community board before every annual plan, long-term plan, these events, and actually decide whether we would prefer to put in a submission or sit at the table. And I think it's absolutely essential to maintaining the integrity and the honesty of our decisions that we understand these differences.
Thank you. Yes, you have. Thank you, Councillor Donaldson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just my view on this issue. We have had very recent precedents, and I speak of the late councillors Walker and Sturt, who both made submissions to council and stood away from the debating table. Anything to do with sale of property, real estate. As a real estate agent, Councillor Sturt always abstained from debate and decision making. And for me, I think this just all boils down to a good understanding of good governance and a matter of personal integrity, and I just leave it at that.
Yes, Your Worship. Thank you.
And I feel so much more comfortable with this process today. Getting the advice is helpful for us, because this is quite a different situation that we find ourselves into compared to other years with the annual plan deliberation. And I always feel personally that we're all elected as councillors to represent the wider views of our community, not just one group, unless you are Te Tata or Te Arawa or Lakes Board or Rural Board. But that's the difference that's come into our thinking around the annual plan. For me, it is the process of working up the annual plan, is the process for councillors to debate when papers come to us, to question and to seek the answers rather than to put in a submission. So that is the process. I also think it's one of education for our wider community. It's hard for them to understand our political processes. And I don't like going into a subcommittee or into public excluded. I think it's better to have the legal advice, the discussion today in open so that we all understand it. But I'm very, very clear with good decision making and good governance, which were your comments at the very beginning, that I'm clear on the open mind and the conflict of interest. And I hope that the members understand it when they make their decision.
Thank you. Yes, Councillor Maxwell.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for the legal advice this morning, because we got away to a rocky start at last week's meeting where we went straight into the hearings and didn't get a chance and didn't realise how far Mr. McPherson was going to take it. But since then, I personally believe that he did have a conflict of interest and does have a conflict of interest, and I think that's been made clearer to me. As someone who sat through many annual plans, I myself have stepped down. Maureen Walker has stepped aside. Bob Martin, Councillor Sturt, as that was mentioned, and even Mark Gould, because I think that's integrity. But if you think you're going to submit and then sit here and make a decision, judge and jury, it's wrong. And I said that the other day, it's wrong. So for me, thank you for making some things much more clearer, but personally, I'm just appalled at Mr. McPherson's bad behaviour. He doesn't participate genuinely, and that's my view.
Thank you very much. Yes, Councillor Kumar.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a comment on what's being passed around, that Dr. McPherson should step down because he's got a conflict of interest. I believe that the conflict of interest should come from within the person, not for someone else to accuse you. And isn't that what's standing? My fellow councillor over here, Councillor Trevor Maxwell, has just said that Dr. McPherson has a conflict of interest. So from that contradicts what the conflict of interest assertion is. I believe that it should come from within rather than being accused of.
Thank you. I think what we've been doing is trying to show that there is an opportunity for someone to do some reflection themselves, actually all councillors, to see is there a conflict of interest. Mrs. Trumper, thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Look, I wrote the letter to Her Worship and the CE, expressing my objection and my concern. And my objection was around the fact that as a community board, we wanted to submit to this annual plan. And I had made arrangements that both Councillor Wang and myself would remove ourselves from the table, and that was our way of dealing with a submission. I sought advice, and that advice was that would even put our submission at risk and my ability to sit at the table. Now, I believe it as a moral values that my ability to deal with the annual plan is better with me at the table. than trying to make a submission. And this was something that was brought home to us back in 2017 when the board actually made a submission, and we had sought advice from LGNZ and the chair of the Community Board Executive, and they both expressed their concern that if we couldn't sit at the table, so we didn't. I think that, I know it is up to the member to decide whether he steps away from the table or doesn't, and it's not up to us to make that decision for him. But I do want to, if the member wants to remain at the table, I would like to record my objection, because I do believe that there is a definite conflict of interest, and so that's what I would like to do, please.
Are there any further? Well, thank you. What I'm going to do now is to take the unusual step of formally asking Councillor McPherson to step down from the deliberations on the annual plan 2021. So I am going to move that, and I'm seeking now a seconder, please. Thank you, Mrs. Trumper. And I will ask if there's any comment or any, before I put that, because I am going to put that motion. So, thank you. Yes, Councillor Donaldson.
Just a question, Madam Chair. This is a request to Dr. McPherson.
Yes, it is a request.
Not a ruling
yes.
from the chair that you're voting on.
Yes, it is a request. It's a formal request. Thank you. My formal request is for Councillor McPherson to step down from participating in the deliberations on the annual plan 2021. So it's been moved and seconded. I'll put that motion. All those in favour, please say aye. Sorry, you want a point of order? Oh, so I did ask, thank you, but I'll give you time. Thank you, I'll give you time. Yes, please. I'm quite happy. I'm quite, I didn't call, I just said it, so I'm quite happy. I did actually ask, is there any comments? I did wait.
Fine.
You can have that.
My comments, I'll be brief, and hopefully not too churlish. But I see this as a continuation of an orchestrated attempt by the inner network to...
Madam Chair, there is no inner network. We're all here as individuals.
I see this as a orchestrated attempt to blacken my name and to refuse to accept that I have a moral position with regard to this issue. I've had to endure over the last week or so, but I've largely ignored all sorts of salacious hints about me possibly having a pecuniary interest. I flatly deny that. People have pointed to a lack of moral probity and have made all sorts of suggestions in that regard. I think they're all utterly inappropriate, and I deny them all. I'd point out to all of my fellow councillors that my original submission concerning the annual plan was openly declared as a preliminary position. It was a preliminary submission. And it's easy enough to scoff, as some prefer to do, but I indicated at my presentation that I'd subsequently revised my position with 9 additional issues that were causing me concern, and I would continue my thinking. And you have yet to hear, at the end of today's proceedings, as to my final position on the annual plan. So I see this as all terribly, premature. People have jumped to conclusions to service their own interests. And so I've now got to the point of feeling that I'm going to continue to press this point, that we all wear many hats. We must learn to accept diverse views, and we, in particular, must allow time for people to give expression to those views, to take on board what other people have to say, and then to revise their position as we intend, I trust, during this morning's proceedings. So I conclude with the view that I continue to have to endure a contrived witch hunt which has got no possibility of resolution, because the council can pass all the resolutions they like, but the Code of Conduct only permits self-recusal. So this has been, in my view, a largely symbolic affair of punishing the people who will hopefully in future refuse to accept the domination of the majority, the tyranny of the majority. Thank you.
Order, Madam Chair.
Yes, thank you.
I think we've got to be very careful about the words. This is a democratically elected table, and in democracy, it is the power of one person's vote, not the tyranny of the majority. We've got to be careful with the words that we use and be more measured.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to put that motion. Oh, sorry, there's no, yes, thank you. Yes, oh, thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a question, just in terms of clarification of this process. We've now got a motion for a formal request that Councillor McPherson step down from participation in the deliberations. However, we actually haven't had declarations of conflict of interest, and I think that as a formal process that those should have been declared or not declared first. And
conflict of interest I'll be bringing up, and it's the second point. It's the next point.
Well, I think that effectively what we're trying to do is predetermine what
No, I'm very clear about what I'm trying to do. Thank you, Councillor Kaifong. And I'd like to do it now. So again, it has been moved and seconded that I'm formally requesting Councillor McPherson to step down from participating in the deliberations on the annual plan 2021. It's been moved and seconded. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Contrary? No. Thank you. We'll take a show of hands on that. Thank you. So all those in favour, please raise your hand.
Can this be recorded, please?
Someone recording? Thank you. Against?
This is please be recorded. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, it's being recorded. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for that. Declarations of interest. Are there any? Sorry. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Now I've got to put the. Thank you. So I did put that formal request to the councillors and to the committee members. Thank you. And so I'm now going to formally ask you, Councillor McPherson, to step aside from the deliberations on the annual plan at our meeting today.
Thank you, but no thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I'm going to move on, councillors. Declarations of interest. Are there any declarations of interest? I'm going to ask two councillors to give me their answer to that. Please, Councillor Kumar, are there any declarations of interest? Thank you. Councillor Bentley, any declarations of interest? No? Thank you. And Councillor, well, you, Councillor, thank you. All right, the indication is no. Thank you. Now, I'm just asking, but I'm specifically asking Councillor Bentley, you and Councillor Kumar, because you are members of the thank you, and the submission was put in on behalf of that organisation. So I'm specifically giving you. I'm specifically giving you the opportunity on this one here to declare an interest, and you've said no. So thank you. Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's just declaring that I don't have a declaration, but I'm changing or just informing the committee that previously I have declared an interest as a Director of Mountain Bike Events Limited and stood away from anything to do with decision making in relation to that entity and delivering of those events. I stood down as a Director of Mountain Bike Events Limited on the 30th of May, so I'm no longer a Director and I have no greater interest in mountain biking than anyone else that rides a bike around town.
Thank you for that, Councillor Donaldson. I always say, if you're unsure, err on the side of safety and just declare. And then thank you. Thank you very much. So we'll move straight on for that. We'll move straight on into the staff reports. May I have a mover and a seconder, please, to receive the report, decision-making following consideration of Council's Annual Plan Information and Engagement Document 2020-2021 be received. A mover and a seconder, please. Thank you, Your Worship. Thank you, Ms Markle. It's been moved and seconded that the report be received. All those in favour, please say aye. Contrary? Thank you. Carried. Morena Rotorua. Thank you very much. So, Thomas, I understand you are going to speak first to the report, or is it the presentation?
Thank you, and good morning, Madam Chair, councillors and board members. Jean-Paul and I are just going to, I would say briefly, but it won't be brief, just take you on a bit of a journey through the deliberations, feedback on the annual plan. So we're just going to do a bit of a tag team, and what we're going to do is work through the whole presentation, and then at the end of it, come back to the individual sections and answer any questions. So with further ado, the annual plan. Oh, there's a slide missing. Wrong presentation. So just my apologies, councillors, but the wrong presentation is on there.
We're adjourning for 1 minute, is that right? Well, perhaps we want to check your phone, your messages or something. Thank you. We've just got a slight glitch. It won't take long.
Yep. So my apologies there, councillors. I'll continue on.
Thank you.
No, that's bringing up the wrong one again.
Doesn't like this.
Oh, it does not like the slides.
You'll have to carry on.
Sorry, apologies, it's not liking some of the slides. I think the annual plan at the moment is in context, I guess, with regards to the world around us. So, sorry, Hilda, can you just exit that, please, and then just show and back up one slide? Thank you. I'll ask you to carry on.
Are we on to it now?
Yep. We'll just work through without visually bringing up the... Yep, so just like this. So we are, again, an annual plan with regards to a world that is significantly impacted with regards to the COVID. If we just go next slide. Again, if you pass me the mouse, I'll drive it from this end. No, sorry. Okay. If we're all ready, councillors, I'll try and start.
Now, what's happening here? How are we going? Are we on or are we off?
We're on. So we just have to work through the presentation in this format because unfortunately a couple of the slides aren't showing up when they're on the screen. We're not too sure why, so we'll just work through it like this. So again, this is decision making following the feedback of the annual plan. With regards to the annual plan itself, the world that we currently face is really no different. If anything, is probably worse with regards to the impacts of COVID-19 and what we're facing. The plan itself is, the need for us to be responding to the unprecedented challenges that are ahead of us and being prepared to change and adapt. And you'll recall during the workshops and preparing the annual plan, it was really focusing on about understanding the emerging issues and having the ability to adapt and respond to the things that are ahead of us. Now, one might believe that our world has not changed that much and we are sort of back to pre-COVID-19 days. But if we go to the next slide, Una, the reality is that while New Zealand is only experiencing a small number of COVID cases, the world around us is completely different. And in particular, at the time of drafting the annual plan, we were all in lockdown and we were all doing this through Zoom meetings. And I think around the 27th of March, there was about 500,000 cases of COVID. And the world was just starting to understand the impacts of what that meant on its communities and its economies. We're now at 10 million cases and no sign of that slowing down. And what we're seeing as a response to that is a lot of information coming out from particularly chief economists in the last week with regards to what they're seeing, how COVID-19 will impact countries' economies. And this is a slide from Westpac's presentation from a couple of weeks ago from their chief economist, Dominic Stevens. And so what they're seeing and predicting is the little dotted line is where they saw New Zealand's GDP going. And just for reference, that's 60 billion to put it into context, so a couple more zeros at the end. And what we're seeing and what they're predicting is actually a very sharp decline in New Zealand's GDP. And every country around the world is sort of seeing something similar. And what they're also predicting is actually a slow recovery, but not a full recovery. And so within 3 years from now, while we get closer back to where the pathway that we were on before COVID, we will never get back to the same path. And to put that into context, you're talking about $2, $3, $4 billion disappearing out of the economy in later years, and what does that mean? What we're seeing at the moment as well, and what they're saying is that at the moment, New Zealand as a whole seems to be a little bit insulated from the economic impacts of this, and that's as a result of the wage subsidy. And the feeling with the chief economist is that if your business at the moment is only surviving because of the wage subsidy, you need to drastically do something different with your business, because when that wage subsidy comes off, it is very unlikely that business will survive in its current form. And in particular, what we're seeing is pent-up activity. Or pent-up demand with regards to consumers. And in a whole, that is driving quite a lot of economic activity. And I think at the previous meeting we had, I think I made the comment that New Zealanders are trying to spend their way out of a recession. But the reality is what we're actually, and what the economists are seeing is that there will be some longer-term effects with regards to impacts on businesses. And in particular, as this slide shows, unemployment. And where that is heading. And you are seeing, therefore, a significant predicted spike in unemployment, even more so than if you think about where we were in 2010, which was with regards to the end of the start of the GFC that we experienced then. We were predicted to go much higher than even that. And that GFC obviously was, it's not called a global financial recession for nothing. It was significant. And so what you're seeing is governments responding. And this is a graph from Westpac again in Treasury with regards to where the government debt is going. And you'll see that back at the 2009 recession, you'll see that government debt raised significantly to protect and to insulate and to ensure New Zealand's recovery. And you'll see with regards to that dotted line where the forecasts are of going forward, that this government is looking to do exactly the same. And so what we're seeing therefore is a general warning that while we're not seeing probably the full effects of this global event and this pandemic, the warning signs are there, and that we have to be aware of what those issues are going forward and be adaptive. And it's, again, very similar to the discussions that we had during lockdown and in preparation of this annual plan. And with that, I'll just hand over to JP.
Morena, councillors. So, councillors, during lockdown, you agreed the 8 integrated strategy pieces that have made up this draft annual plan consultation. And it's important for us just to recognise that all of those pieces are working together, and we've broken down the submission feedback and addressed them to each of those key pieces of that 8 strategy diagram. So, councillors, I'd just like to draw attention to 2 pieces that didn't attract a significant amount of comment, but are actually critical to the integration of the whole, and our ability, as Thomas has signalled, is that the future is still unclear. We do not know when New Zealand will have a bubble, when international tourism will start, or if problems in other parts of the world will continue to create massive global economic impacts. So those 2 tiles at the top, emerging wider impacts and planning to adapt, are actually critical parts of all of the strategies. And something quite different that's been carried into this annual plan is that need for flexibility. So whilst we're putting together an annual plan with all of the other strategies in place, it's important to focus on those 2 strategy pieces there, which are the ones that mean that you will continually stop, reflect, deliberate, take a staged approach and review across the year so that you're making the right decisions at the right time. So whilst we're looking to confirm an annual plan for the year, it's a very different annual plan which will have another number of stage gates for you to check in on progress so we can be adaptive to the changing circumstances that no one can predict at this stage. So that's, as I say, we'll talk a bit more about those pieces later on, but most of the feedback has been focused on some of those other issues around the different strategies, the other 6 strategies. So if I just move into the first of those, which we'll just pick up, the direction strategy, which was really the continuity of council services, really, so putting out there in the annual plan that was critical. And we have a key placemaking set of projects included within the annual plan, and we had committed to through our long-term plan, and we're continuing to focus on. Additionally, obviously, we made references within the consultation document about homes and thriving communities, key focus for this term, and one that had been an emerging issue all the way through. So, councillors, you'll remember when we workshopped some of these strategies during lockdown, we had information and presentations from Dr. Ganesh Nana, economist and RED board member. And for him, he was very clear in saying, look, the purposes of councils remain the same and your kaupapa should not change. So a really important part of focusing on that. So from the feedback, councillors, we identified 12 submitter comments that really related to that direction space. So a real mix of responses, some clearly saying it's the wrong strategy, others confirming the strategic direction that had been set through Vision 2030. A number of points were made there about saying, look, you need to keep protecting those essential services. So that's a given underpinning this long-term plan, was that protection of those essential services, and the important role of council to lead and represent our community and support that recovery. So, as I say, this plan really focuses on that build back better and providing that opportunity to support the community. So our recommendation based on the feedback we received, councillors, would be to continue as proposed around that strategy element. I think the way Thomas and I were intending on doing it is presenting all 8 of those strategies and then coming back to each individual slide for comments or questions. So, councillors, this picks up on those 2 tiles I just mentioned about emerging wider impacts and planning to adapt. So, as you're aware, we've talked about needing to continue to monitor around our well-beings, an important piece of the legislation that guides local government, to keep looking in detail at what we're seeing in those local impacts. The Chair has obviously highlighted several times through different meetings the importance of those social well-beings and cultural well-beings, not just the economic response place. So much wider perspective needed there, and something that we need to keep monitoring through this year and making sure we ensure our focus and our actions really align with those. We also need to adapt to decisions being made by government throughout the year, because we're still unclear as to what interventions they will take. Often we only see them within weeks. So we've been waiting a number of months now for responses on shovel-ready projects as one example. So again, that uncertainty carries into this coming annual plan year. The key there is also to look at maintaining that longer-term focus, but ensuring from a risk management perspective we take a staged approach going forward. So again, these 2 tiles of our integrated strategy framework did not attract any specific comments, though actually are critically important for this annual plan. So just moving to the tile or a strategy around economic recovery planning. So we focused here on saying, look, there needs to be support to work with the business sector, and that was the work that was assigned across to Rotorua Economic Development to work with business leaders and in specific sectors to start identifying short, medium and longer term responses to help the Build Back Better approach. Making sure we're aligning and support the current partnerships and ensuring also that we had sufficient resources to focus on responding effectively. So the feedback in this space, about 14 submitters commented, a lot of support for local business focus. There was some comments and different views on the value or the strength of some of the shovel-ready projects that were submitted. Some concerns about whether there was any reasoning behind putting effort into tourism, but clearly we've spoken previously in workshops about the massive investment of tourism infrastructure and the need to support that and its pivot to more of a domestic focus at least in the foreseeable future. The support then for also recommencing and putting the additional effort back into the capital projects. We've talked previously about one of the first government responses that we received was an urgent call for us to speed up, if possible, the recommencing of the provincial growth funded projects, and to support that, government advanced all of the funding across those different contracts to council in advance so that we could get people working again on those key projects. And there was additional support then for council to be involved in leading economic recovery. So council, sort of our recommendation, and we'll obviously come back to these, is support the plan as planned, and await the outcomes of those Crown Infrastructure Partnership projects, because at this stage we still have no clarity about our 7 projects that had made the government's long shortlist for funding of some level. So as far as investing in recovery, so councillors, again, I've just briefly touched on the desire of government to see us recommence projects as quickly as possible. So as we came out of lockdown, all council projects recommenced with existing contractors. So we were very lucky that most of those contractors were in an effective position to recommence works, and very thankful to be recommencing works. So in addition, as part of this annual plan, it was also the view to put aside the 29 million for partnership projects that will stimulate the economy and create jobs. So a range of initiatives will need to be considered from various sources. So that's been the focus now. So Rotorua Economic Development, through those sector groups, are putting forward some proposals, but also working in partnerships with the Te Arawa Group and others to identify key projects that provide some opportunities for us, as well as a question about whether we should proceed with any of our own shovel-ready projects if government funding does not come through. So a really important opportunity. We also talked about the one-off $1 million of additional funding to support the community initiatives, to build resilience and really to buffer some of those impacts on those important community infrastructure groups. So feedback, councillors, we had 6 submitters make comments in this space. So overall, there was support for the community fund. Having said that, I've just put in brackets there level. So some said maybe not $1 million less, while others had suggested that we should actually take some of the 29 million and move it sideways into another area for funding. So that was quite important. There was some concerns raised about duplication of central government funding. And also the support for the staged approach that had been proposed. So we think that's really important. And councillors, we have highlighted that we will be very careful to watch the interventions being taken by government, and that's part of that ability to adapt. So at this point, we would recommend that you stay as planned, and the criteria for the community fund will be coming to council in August. So an opportunity for we've done some survey work across the various community stakeholders and groups to try and understand where they're positioned, and that's helping us to shape those criteria that we will be presenting to you in August. Decisions on the 29 million are clearly council decisions, and what we'll be seeing there is probably a pipeline of project proposals coming through from those different sources across the 2 years that funding has been allocated. So that's the proposal at this stage. Homes and thriving communities. Clearly now, council, we've adopted the joint strategy with Te Arawa, and it's out for consultation till about mid-August. So 13 submitters made comments around housing. So certainly some support for the housing strategy, also wanting to see greater emphasis on neighbourhoods and the development of the community infrastructure within neighbourhoods. So other than using this consultation feedback here within the annual plan process, we will also be bringing it back into finalising that strategy when we seek to adopt that towards the end of August. Also some desire to see greater efforts around fast tracking, and also there was that additional request around taking money out of the 29 million and considering it around additional support for food banks. Also some issues around, or suggestions around, waiving fees to stimulate and support development, and obviously that's something for us to look at through that housing strategy as well. And comments about CBD vitality, and obviously our responses around homelessness in the CBD as well. Also really positive to see the support for the Child Equity Program. So councillors, at this stage we would suggest that the feedback just be referred across to that strategy. We know that within this annual plan we've included some additional funding to support work in the housing area, and so that really underpins part of the annual plan process as well. Finally, on key projects, again, so 18 submitters in this space, support for continuing projects, and obviously a number of submitters noted the importance and the prioritisation of the museum. So I'm extremely positive that we have received additional funding at the weekend to support that project, so that's great for our community. And obviously also the desire to recognise that a lot of the projects create wonderful spaces for us as locals, so lakefront, forest, and other investments through other key projects. Importance of encouraging private investment, which creates jobs, so central to a lot of our key projects. But also some requests to consider the prioritisation or continuing on with some projects. I suppose disappointing that some haven't recognised that for some of those projects, certainly the forest projects, it's actually 3/4 or 80% plus complete, so it's actually tailing off as a completed project. Things like the lakefront have had a substantial amount of preparatory work in place, so very difficult to change that. And I think some of the comments have ignored the fact that actually we're in a contracted relationship with the Provincial Growth Fund for funding. So, and as I said, Provincial Growth Fund and government approached us very early on and asked us to recommence as quickly as possible our major projects, and even extended all of our funding up front. So again, some comments there which probably don't recognise the reality of our relationship around some of our key projects. Interesting things there about saying get on with the aquatic centre, but equally, and probably something that flies against some of the council's approach, which is the absoluteness of needing to undertake the renewals across all of our assets, and that includes the aquatic centre. And then some queries about levels of debt and whether we should continue to spend on projects. So, so whilst we have a strong focus on getting on with projects, building infrastructure, creating new jobs, we also had the counter views coming through about debt and not undertaking a number of key projects. So our proposal here is that we should continue as proposed, mainly because most projects are committed to through the long-term plan or contractually underway.
So on some of the financial strands, so prudent use of debt. So just a reminder, where we're looking to utilise debt to provide a rates postponement or deferment for the fourth quarter of the 2020 year. Looking to fund the $29 million of partnership projects yet to be determined through debt, the Community Resilience Fund. One-off to cover operational shortfalls in revenues as a result of COVID and the likely recession. Providing the airport up to an additional $1 million worth of funding, which is a recognition of obviously the reductions in services and the reductions in fees that they get to operate the airport. Support Infracore with regards to some critical capital replacements. But overall, the debt itself was really driving a really large underlying $120 million capital works program that was focusing on museum, performing arts centre, lakefront, and as well as the debt's not obviously being used to fund renewals, but there's a large renewal program in there as well. With regards to the feedback, so there were some 9 submission points on them. Similar themes with regards to do not borrow for OPEX, do not support raising the debt cap, and work on other ways to reduce debt. The recommendation is to support the proposed use of debt. So we are only looking to utilise debt to fund revenue shortfalls and obviously the year with regards to the reduction in fees and charges as a result of COVID as a one-off. Not looking to increase the debt cap. If anything, we've actually looked at the timing of the capital works program and ensured that we stay below the self-imposed debt cap, but also provide headroom with regards to having the ability to respond to strategic challenges going forward. And so therefore the recommendation there is to adopt what is being proposed in the draft annual plan. With regards to rates, so just a reminder, we proposed a 0% general rate charge, but an overall 4.7 driven with regards to the targeted rates. The main one in particular was around the sewerage activity, and there's a separate public consultation or statement of proposal, which you'll be considering as well shortly, followed by water, economic development and waste management. And the waste management one was a result of the loss of recycling revenues and the increase in tonnage. With regards to the feedback on that, overall 16 submission points, supporting the 0% general rates increase, but was mainly comments around not keeping rates with CPI, how the rate was being communicated and how information was being displayed. There was support for the UAGC reduction, with some actually submitted saying it wasn't enough, and that was contrasted by support for, or challenging, saying the UAGC shouldn't be reduced. And so overall there was feedback on both sides. And then the overall fairness of the rates. Before we dive into what happened in there, I'm just going to touch on the wastewater statement of proposal. So you were going to obviously review that. You're aware that the decision-making or deliberation on that statement of proposal is being moved to the end of the month. That gives you time to consider, discuss the points and to make an appropriate decision at the end of July. So what we've done is, bearing in mind that we have to adopt an annual plan before that takes place, looking at the timing of that decision, looking at realistically probably the two options in the plan that you'll make a decision on, and blended the two with regards to a hybrid budget that, based on the decision that you make at the end of July, will fund either of those two options. That's probably, I can't go into a lot more detail because it'll get a lot complex with regards to how we've achieved that, but we believe we can set the budget to accommodate both scenarios based on the pathway of the decision and the timings and so forth going forward. And so as a result, my D's in the wrong place there, what it has done is brought the 4.7 down to 4%. So again, the general rate is 0% and the targeted rates providing an overall 4%. So that's a reflection of the reduction in the targeted rate for sewerage, which reflects the timing changes of how you will likely make a decision. And as I said, the funding allocated in the annual plan will allow for both scenarios based on where you may choose to make that decision at the end of the month. And so how is this made up? Again, similar amounts, but what we are seeing is obviously that the targeted rate for sewerage will come back and overall change. So what does that mean from a sample ratepayer perspective? On the left-hand side is where the sample ratepayer sat with the overall the 4.7 targeted rate, and on the right the new proposed. And what we are seeing is that because it's a reduction in the sewerage charge, we're seeing a close to a 1% reduction or a 0.8% reduction for residential properties. Obviously, those residential properties with lower CV are seeing a larger increase. If I zoom in on this, hopefully you'll see. So this is where they were before. The range was 5.9 to 4%, and what they've shifted to is 5.1 to 3.5. The other ones that have benefited the most from that is obviously the business area, which ranges from, in the sample ratepayers, 2.8 to 3.4, but you'll see that the average is 4.7, and I'll go into that a little bit more. they've also reduced slightly as well. And so overall, the change that targeted rates, again, provides sufficient funding for each alternative based on what you make, but also, I guess, delivers against the desires of around affordability, equality and equity, and as a whole reduces the fixed charge amount that's being imposed on this year, and tries to maintain a little bit more of that progressive tax nature rather than regressive. With regards to the rates relief, we're looking, there was around continuing to offer the rates deferment into 2021 and looking to achieve one-off savings in the annual, the budgets themselves to achieve a 0% change to the general rate. We received one submitter feedback on that point, and that was more around a case of you should just be cancelling rates demands and not deferring them. So obviously by cancelling them, we would forego the revenues. What was shown, obviously, around the fourth instalment of the 2020 year, where we had only 100 applications, which is great, but not the size that we were expecting, is that we don't believe we need to do a formal arrangements for the rates deferment into this next financial year, and we'll just monitor with regards to where the world changes to. And again, just offer out to our community again that anyone under the financial distress has the ability to make contact with us, and we can work through an arrangement similar to what we were offering in that scheme. So the recommendation there is obviously to monitor and stay on top of it. But what we have noticed is that there is one sector that is being impacted more significantly than others with regards to the rates, and that's actually the accommodation providers. And you recall, and it's predominantly down to the sewerage charge. You and I in our own homes only pick up one sewerage charge, but accommodation providers pick up a sewerage charge based on every individual toilet or pan that they have in their residences. And so what we have seen is that the majority of accommodation providers in the rates increase percentages are actually sitting at about 7s, 8s, 9s, 10s, and even some at 15s. And it's all unique based on the size of their properties, the capital values, and so forth. And so what we are recommending is providing up to about $100,000 remission through the existing remission scheme, where we will soften and cushion the blow for those commercial accommodation providers to bring that percentage of rates increase back closer to that average. Not saying we're going to bring it to that average, but to soften it. And so that is the one change that we are recommending that Council considers and changes. With regards to Tarawera, there was a lot of feedback on Tarawera, seeking that the scheme not be deferred, that it be included in the annual plan, that that water quality is important, and so all those sorts of elements of it. With regards to the recommendation, there is that just a reminder to councillors and community board members that within the annual plan, Tarawera was always a project with regards to year 5 and 6, which was 2023, 2024. That's when the construction was budgeted to commence, and so that's 2.5 years away. Bearing in mind that budgets and timings can be brought forward and move based on things that are happening. So currently, we have completed a cultural impact assessment. By September 20, what that cultural impact assessment and is kind of highlighted is that we need to talk to our partners, and in particular, we need to talk to iwi out at Tarawera. And so what Stavros and his team are doing, and hope to have finalised by September 2020, is understanding their views, and in particular, it's around having on-site treatment or not, or scheme-specific treatment or not, and what that may look like. Once those discussions have been finalised, it will be coming back to council with regards to a decision, and it's likely that based on those timings, not likely it will, that will form probably a cornerstone discussion with regards to the long-term plan, because around September 2020 is when we're going to start drafting our next long-term plan for consultation in April 2021, and therefore this decision around Tarawera will be formed or will be made based on the LTP adoption around June 2021. And so what we see is that there was a lot of feedback, but with regards to the pathway that we're on, we see no change to the annual plan. We can't bring the construction forward because we're committed to a process at the moment, and once that process has been completed, obviously that information will come to council, and council will make the decision as to whether to proceed and the timing of it. And it looks like the last two slides are not prepared to work either. And so overall, the plan itself, we believe, still delivers on cushioning the blow. Oh, sorry. The proposed changes overall provide a reduction in the targeted rates, bringing the overall increase from 4.7 to 4. We're looking to provide support for the commercial accommodation sector, and we believe as well that we can provide an annual plan that provides adequate funding to support the wastewater decision that you'll make later in this month. And just on the next slide, please. And so that overall, the plan itself, we believe, delivers on cushioning the blow for our community, but more so supports our community, and in particular around the projected economic recovery that is going to take place, but retains flexibility, and that flexibility will allow us on behalf of the community to respond to uncertainty, and in particular to those strategic challenges that will face our community going forward. So with on that, any questions?
Thank you very much for that. Actually, some good feedback there. Some really good feedback. I noticed the words encourage, strengthen, review, commend. So it's good feedback. Thank you for that. I know there'll be some questions. Yes, Your Worship.
Just a question. I think it's magnificent that you've managed to really target it around the 8 objectives that we had, and they can't be taken apart. They all must work in an integrated way. So that to hear that news of it going from 4.7 to 4 means you've listened. Well, we've listened. And where you're suggesting the changes is quite finessed. It feels great. My only question, and I sort of knew the answer, but where did our messaging get a bit skewed on Tarawera? Because we all got it, and you know, and I'm a great proponent, as is the Lakes Community Board, but somewhere they got it in their, you know, they did get the impression that we were deferring it way out before the 23-24 construction. Where did we go wrong on that?
I think that's something I have to own with regards to a comment I may have made when we were talking about debt, and let's just say that the community is quite passionate about it and took it a certain way. I mean, rest assured, the organisation's approach and how it is tackling Tarawera hasn't changed. We've always committed to it, and we're currently in a process of it. And those that actually formed the groups and came in and talked to us actually knew about that as well. So I'm not too sure exactly where that confusion came from, but I think what it did highlight is obviously that there's parts of that community, if not all of it, that are passionate about this, and Stavros and his team will continue to work through that process.
Enormously helpful. I heard they thought they could come and submit before the hearings today, and I was able to say to them, you can't do that. Other submitters are not given another crack at it. But that's helpful, and I'm sure they'll rest a little easier tonight.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Your Worship. Perhaps they just wanted to make sure that they weren't going to be forgotten, but their presence was felt, certainly. Look, can you just tell me how, because we didn't ask questions as we moved through all of those different sections, so what do you propose to do now? Because I know that there will be questions under each of those areas, so can you just tell us how you'd
we're
like
happy to now go back to probably the start of the presentation and just work through each of those individual sections with regards to the slides, direction and so forth, and answer any questions on each of those and probably confirm whether council is happy with the recommendation or not.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Yes. So we'll just go back to the start. Look, while we're getting this, I think we'll take this could be a bit of a lengthy session. It will be, actually, I suspect. So I propose that we take a 5-minute break quickly. Thank you. And you can get that back up.
Oh, we're there now.
Thank
Yep.
you.
We're right there.
Thank you, Madam Chair. You started out with a warning, a very precise warning about the slow recovery and not a full recovery. Very serious international, something like 3 to 4 billion out of the economy. That's a fairly sound and solid warning, and I thoroughly agree with your analysis in that area. When you were looking then at directions that are going to be feasible and possible in such a context, you came to the conclusion there was to be no change in direction. That appeared to be what's called a logical discontinuity. One did not follow from the other. With no improvements to direction considered as a result of that context of 3 or 4 billion dropping out of the economy.
I think there was some serious consideration. I think all councillors and community board members can remember the Zoom sessions that we had where we talked about the annual plan and the direction, the Build Back Better, the role that council should take with regards to ensuring the economic recovery of Rotorua, and the heart of this plan is actually delivering on that. And I think if you with regards to the context of these slides, yes, New Zealand will face a drop in GDP. Rotorua will also face that as well, and in a way where governments respond to that with regards to spending in the right areas to ensure the economic recovery of our district. And if I just come back to this, in 2009, the government didn't stop spending with regards to when it faced the global recession. If anything, it spent more, and you can kind of see that with regards to where its borrowing came from, and it's looking to do the same. And in a way, Rotorua is the council is similar in that vein. We're not looking to contract and stop doing things. If anything, the demands from our community are there. What we are looking to do is provide funding to support projects that will help lift and shift Rotorua, and in particular focusing on community well-being and economic recovery. And that's, I guess, at the heart of the plan.
Can I just add to that? And I think it goes back to the purpose of why there is councils and local government, and that's to make democratic decisions for now and for the future. So there is a long-term direction, and we spent a lot of time in those hui during the lockdown when we talked about the issues that faced this community were quite clear and had driven the direction setting that this council has established over the last few years. Post-COVID, they're the same issues, only worse. So that focus is still there. So there has been a reflection on how we address those and what we need to focus on in this plan to try and move harder against those issues which have been exacerbated by COVID. But the longer term direction remains the same, and that was the discussion that was had through those workshops. Those same issues are still there. So the level of unemployment in Rotorua significantly higher than the national average. Post-COVID, it will go significantly higher than the national average, and we will need to focus on that as recovering into changing this community if we're to achieve our long-term objectives. So the goals are still the same, they have just got harder to attain. And that's been the focus of preparing into this annual plan, that flexibility to respond, but also to look at those mechanisms that we use to be able to influence that. And the key of that is working in partnerships with our community and with government to try and affect those.
Thank you, and that's certainly what I got from the start, that the focus and the direction for council hasn't changed. It's how we're actually going to do it now, bearing in mind COVID has changed the landscape. But it's certainly the desirable future that we set and we wanted for the community is still the same. Councillor Donaldson, then your worship.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Through you, I've got two questions, but the focus, I think, in part is about cushioning the impact, and that's the big impact, as your graph showed, is in unemployment, in jobs. So it's about keeping people, as far as we can, in jobs. My question, the first one, was around, you talked about this is a budget that maintains essential services, but post the GFC, there was a conscious decision of this council to sweat assets and not necessarily invest in asset renewal, and that's come back to bite us, as we can see through some of the discussion over the wastewater services proposal. So does that maintaining essential services imply maintaining our level of asset renewal is my first question. And shall I get an answer?
So the answer there is yes, it does. One of the bottom lines we have is ensuring that the renewal of assets takes place and funding priority goes to those first. So there's never a debate as to what the level of renewal should be. We should always spend the right amount to ensure that our assets are being looked after.
Thank you. And through you again, Madam Chair, just in terms of this being a budget that aligns with central government, and probably a question for JP, in terms of the applications for Provincial Growth Fund and shovel-ready projects, how important is it that local government has some skin in the game in terms of co-investing in those projects as to the success of those applications?
I think I have to be honest and say we don't know, Councillor. At this stage, we went for 100% funding for all the projects. The airport one was the one which had potential match funding, but then again it also had a link to improvements on Tenai Road, which was again 100% request for roundabout interventions. So at this stage, we do not know whether the government will come back around to say you could do more or get more if there is a contribution from council coming into that. So I think for us we need to look at what they would look at funding and how that now fits with how we achieve that support, as you indicated previously, on jobs and economic recovery.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a bit supplementary, I guess this highlights the importance of the 29 million fund and decisions coming back to council depending on the level of support that does or doesn't come for those applications.
Thank you. Yes, thank you, Jeff.
So, through the Chair, I think JP may like to comment though. Whilst we don't know about the CIP results, we do know about our experience with the Provincial Growth Fund, and I think it's worthwhile, JP, if you could maybe comment on the importance of central government confidence in terms of local investment.
Yeah, and I think that is that part of that partnership discussion. You know, government seeking to take a whole government approach, and in talking whole of government, they are very keenly interested and have an expectation about working within your local community. That's certainly been some of the criticisms I've seen directed at projects from officials, where they've just seen projects pulled out of LTPs or councils almost seeking to retrench from what they had committed to and passing that request to central government. So I think a number of projects, probably that close to 1,000 that didn't make the long shortlist, fall into some of those categories where they're not ready or they were simply a passing through of a request for funding which should have been undertaken locally. I think where you are seeing most of the key projects being supported by government is where they get to also see the leveraging of their investment into being matched by local government, and also more importantly into the private sector as well. So we've created that track record of bringing together the partners and encouraging and maintaining those partnerships to try and look through and beyond this period.
Yes, thank you. I mean, we do have already a history in partnerships, probably before most other councils, if not many of them. Yes, Your Worship, thank you.
Well, it was around that I think the scene setting here, we even heard it on Saturday actually, jobs, 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 for 2 million for a new roof for the museum. I heard jobs, jobs, jobs. So it's not just about economic recovery. And I love the settings here, and I'm really proud of them. And yesterday at a Zone 2 meeting of Local Government New Zealand, we heard about having to put skin in the game, having to have partnerships, and we've got the emerging partnership with the Te Arawa plan going to come to us soon, and the partnerships with the business community and philanthropy who have helped us, regional council who have helped us. And when we get the right partnership around the project, then we're seeing the returns, and people are saying, how are you getting this investment? And it's because of that setting that we set in Vision 2030, right. And we're not changing. And so for me, the settings are absolutely right. They're giving our wider community confidence. They're showing that we're prepared to be nimble and adapt, and we're also managing risk. And I think that's what we tried to capture at our early workshops. I absolutely urge we hold resolutely, as we heard from our economist, hold and don't change, don't move, keep the community confident, keep your vision and keep going, but smart investment in the projects that make the difference. And the other point was not getting rid of council staff. Oh, you know, I think that was fantastic. During the time of real crisis, we just kept the confidence that we would have to stand up this organisation again. And actually, I'm a bit worried about capability to deliver aspirations, but that's another story that will come another day. But I absolutely recommend continue as proposed.
Thank you, Your Worship. Councillor Kumar.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, JP. Thank you, Mr. Collet, for your presentation. And I'll just muddle through a few things. You know, I'm always very conservative when it comes to that. You know, and this shows where the economic recovery is going. I think when we look back to where Christchurch was, but that was just one city affected, but it affected all of us. So the whole country got behind trying to sort of get Christchurch back on its feet after 2012. Today, it's a probably different city, you know, still coming to terms with post-earthquake. COVID's going to be with us for a long time. I think we either now start to address that, hey, look, we need to move forward, and look at the opportunities that are going to present ourselves, or we go into a shell. And I think this is probably an opportunity for us to look at, because most other councils have showed that they're cutting back seriously, and they're not going to take that opportunity. While we must seriously look at being smart in certain areas, I think this is a great time for us to look at growing lots of other areas as well. There will be unemployment, there will be lost opportunities, but there will be some great opportunities if we grasp them. So I think we must continue to look at opportunities for infrastructure. We must also continue to look for opportunities in partnerships and say that, hey, look, we can set the paradigm for growth in this time when others are cutting back.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, smart leadership is a prerequisite. Councillor Kaifong.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I too support the direction that you've got up there on the slide. It's just a question with COVID, because there are just so many unknowns. We just don't know what's going to happen. Is that how do we ensure that we remain flexible enough and nimble enough to be able to react quickly and adapt quickly to what's happening out there in the community?
You start. Madam Chair, we've signalled in there two of those strategies was around managing that risk by staging capital expenditure, but also looking at the emerging impacts. And so the monitoring and review, I think, is something that we have increased our focus on. So trying to understand what's happening out there in the community has become far more important for us. And we are gathering quite a bit of information, and I suppose next week we were proposing just to go through some of the metrics that we're using to try and track what's happening in our community and understanding some of those wider issues and wider impacts. So I think your question goes to the ability for us to adapt and respond. So I think the key that we've created within this is hopefully that expectation that we will be taking a flexible approach, and we will be coming back to you regularly to say, this is where we're up to, this is what's changed, this is what's not changed, and this is a recommended adjustment or alteration to a planned or a non-planned step. So I think for us, we're going to have a far more reactive, responsive approach than what would normally have been undertaken. I think Thomas has highlighted things like renewals. Those are a given, and so we will proceed with a program to continue to make sure we look after our core assets and ensure they're renewed across the year. But everything else that we do will be based on watching what's happening and the emerging circumstances out there in our community, and also what the government's response is. Because again, we've seen over certainly the last few months them make decisions that have injected money into certain sectors, changing policy and delivering different outcomes. So we're going to have to watch all of those things and make sure that we're adapting to them. So even the discussions around that community fund, we've taken what information we know now. We've taken our survey results, so we'll be bringing back to you in August that information to set the criteria for the use of that fund. But we may be looking at throttling that fund across the year to ensure if there's changes in government policy or government funding in different locations, we will adjust.
Thank you. Mr. Thomas?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and Thomas and JP, thank you for your presentation, very thorough. And look, I just wanted to comment about us presenting a positive message to our communities going forward and continuing to work on these projects. And on the news practically every night I see a town that we're often compared with because of our tourism base, which is Queenstown, and every night they're on TV, they're crying that their town is dying, you know, all these disastrous effects for them. And I think the contrast with us, where we're going out to our communities and saying we're going to be there supporting you, we're going to be continuing to work on these projects so that we're in a really strong position when the economy recovers, I think is an excellent way to be proceeding. I think it's showing leadership and responsibility to our community, so thank you.
Thank you. Ms Yates?
Through you, Madam Chair, kia ora kōrua. I wanted to actually touch on the point that you raised, JP, and that was around the community, 1 million Community Resilience Fund. And what I wanted to just sort of ask is if there is any underspend and cushioning of the blow with the 29 million, could there be a possibility of increasing this fund? One of our key messages is tātou tātou, we together. We use kupu like manaakitanga, but I would certainly like to see our community supported. So, kia ora.
Thank you. I think that's also where you're going to keep an eye on what central government is doing in that space as well. Councillor Bentley.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a question for Mr. Colley. Thomas, do you think that the next 12 months or so we're going to have to, or you recommended that we borrow to cover operating costs?
So, thank you, Councillor. You'll recall one of the cornerstones, well, it's not, one of the elements of this annual plan is a recognition that Council may face up to $4 million worth of revenue shortfalls. And we talked during the workshops and before the consultation document went out with regards to the options available to us of how to deal with that. Because those fees and charges are all in critical services such as building consents, etc., it was felt the prudent step was not to reduce staffing and services in those areas, but to cover anticipated shortfalls for the 12-month period while the economic recovery rebuilds and revenues rebuild through debt. But it also recognises that the revenue shortfall is uncertain. It may be 4 million, it may be $500,000. It is all going to depend with regards to how New Zealand and Rotorua transitions through this period, and that's that uncertainty. And yes, the Council went out and proposed in the annual plan that we would use debt to soften and to look after that area.
Thank you. Thank you. Can we move on then to our next? Thank you.
So, emerging wider impacts and planning to adapt. There was no feedback on those. And just wonder whether we'll therefore just include that into the economic recovery planning as well, which had 14 submitters comment. Want to cover this one off or just open to questions again?
Can I just ask a question on the wellbeing, and of course that's still the government's. How are we going to ensure that we're networking in with some of our key government departments here in Rotorua so that we never lose sight of the wellbeing and possibly the reduction in poverty and all of those things which are going to be so important?
Madam Chair, I think one of the things, and Jeff might want to add to this, that we've seen through the lockdown period and its continuing post-lockdown is a significantly more involvement of the government agencies and key community groups in talking to each other and exchanging information and highlighting those critical issues. We've certainly been involved in a number of Zoom meetings and meetings with heads of MSD, police, the DHB, a whole range of agencies coming together and making sure that as best as possible there is a really clear view of the issues and the information that we're seeing. So there's a significant amount of discussions going on then about, so how do we respond to those? So what can we do collectively? So a real openness and I suppose this is the silver lining on a terrible cloud, is that interagency working and that all-of-government approach has been accelerated, I think, through this process, and it's really sharpening everyone's focus on how we can work collectively. There is still information gaps, and I think a lot of that is into the community sector or the not-for-profit sector, and some of the soft metrics out there in the community that we need to get better at gathering. But there is a significant amount of information sharing, I think, which is really aligning efforts far better than they have in the past. I don't know if Jeff wants to add to that.
Thank you. It was really around the information sharing so that everybody's current and up to date with what's happening in those critical social sector areas. Thank you, Your Worship.
Just a question there that we did learn in COVID when we had the volunteers morning tea was when we heard about the Te Arawa response and the hapu and the database, I wondered if our GIS is smart enough to connect with what Te Arawa knows about their community and our wider community, especially when we're looking at equity over time. There were some families in surprising areas that had no access to the internet. So it wasn't those that we'd put in black spot funding for, it was those in town here. So I think a sharper focus in there about matching data, and do we need, not this year, Thomas, but do we need to look at an investment where we start matching data better with the DHB, with our Te Arawa data and our own data? It's just a flag that came out that's some concern, because that's definitely going to be the way of connecting and building resilience in the future.
I'll just have a brief comment there. I guess two of the most powerful things of our organisation, one is probably our staff and second is the data that we hold. And are we utilising that data as effectively and efficiently as possible? And I think the answer is no, and that's something we're on a pathway for. Consolidating the data, making it readily available to our community to help them make decision-making processes and binding all those things together. And yeah, rest assured that is a bit of a focus for us over the coming 18 months to 2 years to tidy that up.
Mrs. Trumper?
Thank you, Madam Chair, through you. JP, this is probably one for you. I know that most of these projects, especially the shovel-ready, are awaiting the outcome of the CIP. And I know that the fast-tracked RMA projects were announced about a couple of weeks ago, and government suggested in another couple of weeks that we would be getting our answers. Is there any indication from government when those announcements are likely?
The short answer is no. The longer answer is a lot of them are still working through all the different government departments and probably now starting to appear on ministers and desks as far as recommendations to start considering when they'll be announced. So I have a suspicion we're getting very, very close to the point when we see a lot of announcements coming quite rapidly. But at the moment, we haven't received our detail yet.
I presume they'll all be announced prior to the election anyway, or before the House rises, which is about whatever date that is. So it's not too far away. Councillor McPherson.
Thank you, Chair. This category of feedback elicited from the public a greater diversity of views than almost any other. It was massive diversity, and I wondered if one of the options that you considered was to actually pause on preparing this report and indicate that because of the uncertainty over the CIPs, that it might be a good opportunity to wait and then make a more informed set of recommendations in the light of the CIP outcomes. And I wondered if that had been the case in your thinking, because of that massive diversity in views. The second question I've got relates to that, and it's, can you please define what you mean by hybrid budgeting? This is not a term I'm familiar with. Thank you.
The hybrid budgeting was a hybrid of the budget between the two different options. And rather than go into specific detail here, I'm happy to walk Councillor through it if they have any questions after the fact as to how I achieve that. But yeah.
As far as timing is concerned, Councillor, we have to sign off an annual plan when we have to sign off an annual plan. So we can't wait for the government decision. So they're tracking along on the timing that they determine and the analysis and the government department discussions that they require. So we've had to adopt or head towards adopting an annual plan with the information that we have. And I think that highlights again why we've created the flexibility and the adaptations within this plan. Again, we're not sitting there with an amount tagged to any projects. Any projects that come before you will be for you to make a decision with the information that you have. So when we have some decisions around shovel ready, it may require some partnership funding, it may not, and there will be other project considerations potentially from other sources. So what we're trying to create is the flexibility for you to go into this annual plan to make decisions.
Thank you both. That's helpful. In such circumstances, when you're forced to make a decision in conditions of gross uncertainty, one possibility is to come up with recommendations which speak about a range of possibilities rather than one particular recommendation. And my hope was that hybrid budgeting would turn out to be contingency budgeting, that you put up if then, you put up a series of proposals, and that gives you quite explicitly the flexibility you need. Sorry, just a suggestion.
My comment on hybrid budgeting was specific to the sewerage activity and the need to fund that activity with regards to the number of proposals that are ahead of you. With regards to the flexibility that you talk about, I believe the fund and how we got that is just that. If no initiatives come out or if it's not needed, then the funds won't be drawn on and therefore the debt won't be incurred and so forth. However, if initiatives do come up, which we hope that they will, Council will make a decision and will make an informed decision with regards to where that is. So one alternative is to provide the funding with regards to it. It provides the envelope that you will live within or not. If a better initiative comes out and you wish to exceed 29 million, we will talk about the consequences of it, versus the alternative way of budgeting is to just not have anything there and then come back to Council and discuss them at that time. So what we are indicating is that there is about $200 million worth of work in front of the government with regards to CIP. We're in the moment having discussions with sector community groups with regards to what they're seeing with regards to investment opportunities to help build Rotorua back better. And what we're indicating is that we will provide up to $29 million of funding into those projects should the Council wish to do so.
Thanks. It's reassuring, and I go back to Councillor Donaldson's comment when he indicated that those decisions would come back to Council.
Yes.
Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
This is the strategy that it's being proposed at present, and it will be flexible. And should anything change, obviously it comes back to Council. I'm going to move on to Oh, yes, thank you.
Comment that we were given a wonderful presentation by Una Hopkins about rhythm and beautiful dance and moving together. And that gave us the railway line that showed us about when we needed the annual plan. So we don't have the wriggle room to extend it out till we hear CIP. It's as simple as that. We got the presentation, we all listened and thoroughly enjoyed it.
Yes, no, nothing gets put on hold until everything's, all ducks in a row. Absolutely not. Thank you.
Through the chair, I think it is worthwhile. I just wanted to make a comment just to set expectations. We have had a number of sector groups operating under red. All of those sector groups have actually come back with a very clear set of expectations that council will be there at the table contributing in their own way to different aspects of those sectors. I think the problem that we're going to have is actually there will be an expectation of much greater investment than what in reality we are likely to be able to provide. I don't think we're in a situation where we are uncertain whether or not this money will be spent. I think what we are uncertain of is precisely where we will spend it at the moment. The likelihood of finding ourselves at the end of the year saying, isn't this amazing? We never thought Rotorua would have actually not required any investment whatsoever. So I think it's just worthwhile just tempering your expectations as we go into this with the view that we've already heard from the sector groups that local government investment is going to be required in these various sectors.
Thank you. Councillor Maxwell, did I see your hand up? Oh, no, thank you. Councillor Kumar.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think Jeff's answered something that I was going to ask, but I'll be very brief. And this probably could wait till operational on Thursday. But while we're deliberating and investing in recovery on tourism shovel projects, my question is that although we're deliberating for the annual plan, are we waiting for this annual plan to kick in before we start the recovery for tourism, like even if it is local? I see tourism, Taupo is just firing all the shots at the moment, saying come to your senses. And it does appeal that, hey, look, it's not whether it's snowing or not, or whether the ski fields are open or not, but it just gives people a perspective to say, hey, look, let's go around Taupo. Maybe if we had a joint venture between Taupo, Rotorua, or some things in terms of what's it, but we all know that we all need that recovery, and we need to spend to get people to come over here because it keeps them alive. This morning we saw the European Union's just opened their borders to 8 other places. We don't know next week what's going to happen and how, whether it's going to be. Like I said, COVID's here to stay. We just have to plan to keep moving forward so that we don't get stuck in a rut.
It's a good question, but we haven't been marking time, and I think there are a couple of comments from Jeff. Thank you.
I think, Councillor Kumar, what you're highlighting is a point that was actually raised in the sector groups, is that the sector groups are very clear at the moment that there's a balance here between the need to be cautious, but also the need not to be so cautious that actually we don't create that element of hope and optimism. So the sector groups are very clear, whether it be the inner city, whether it be the tourism sector, that there does need to be early, fast, accelerated intervention by central government, by local government, by the sector to create actually an environment of hope and optimism. Because without that, fundamentally, private sector will actually not invest. So we're in this invidious position that ideally we would say, let's not do anything until we know ideally what's happening. But unfortunately, that ideal is actually not possible because all of our sector groups are saying, well, what are you going to do about the CBD? What are you going to do about attracting tourism domestic tourism into Rotorua? And it's those sort of things that we can't just fundamentally say, well, until we know what's happening, we're not going to do anything. It's just not an option. So we are having to move at pace with those sectors. And so you will be seeing projects coming back to you very quickly over the next month or so where you'll be making decisions on.
Thank you. JP, you wanted to comment, and then we'll move on.
I was probably just going to make one other comment, which is what we've seen in a lot of RTOs, regional tourism organisations, ours is combined under RED, is a change in their focus of their marketing budgets, for example. So those that were had predominantly focused offshore were now swinging their efforts and their funding to running local campaigns. And so you highlighted one particular area that had. They chose to use most of their budget to go into the 6 o'clock news. But there was a national approach also being applied. So within RED, there has been a watching of what's happening nationally. So there's been a significant amount of government funding going into encouraging people to visit domestic destinations. And so they've been very clear about watching what's happening from a national perspective and adapting their local campaigns. So there has been a significant amount of campaign investment into attracting people towards the school holidays and certainly towards the spring. So that's part of the refocus of the marketing within RED. So they have been working closely with the sector group that the Chief Executive described to make sure we've got the right focus to encourage people to come here as domestic visitors.
Thank you. Mr. Thomas.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to address the $1 million one-off fund to support community initiatives. It's fantastic to see that in our budget. I think it needs to be there, addressing our wellbeing responsibilities. And also I'm aware of so many of our community organisations that are suffering a severe financial impact from not only people not necessarily having enough money to donate to causes, but also, of course, the loss of income from pokie machines during lockdown and stuff like that. I have a lot of sympathy for a couple of the submissions that suggested that grant may be flexible, may have a higher ceiling. I would love to see that. I'd love to see it as not just being a one-off, but something that we look at going into the future. We're going to have the gambling consultation coming up to us in a little while, and when we get to there, we'll see that there is a sizable part of our community that see that as a very destructive vice within our community. And I think back to when we changed from cigarettes providing a lot of the income, or drink providing a lot of the income for community organisations, and how government and local government needed to step into that gap and help them fund and develop other sources of funding. So great to see that there, and I'd love to see it in.
The question is, with regard to RED, are they going to interact with Council and keep us in the loop as to what their direction or what their suggested direction for Rotorua is going to be?
You just mentioned that.
Look, if I can say, RED has actually taken the lead and has led the creation and the development of the sector groups, and they are now coming to an end. What the sector groups have identified is effectively a range of projects which they believe would actually create value going forward, and Council will need to consider. Those projects have been passed to our strategy group. The strategy group are working with RED at the moment, and as those projects come through a feasibility assessment phase, they'll be coming to Council.
Thank you.
Could I add to that response?
Yes, and I'm going to move on in a moment because we've still got a few more sections.
Just responding to Councillor Bentley, and I'm pretty sure every councillor got an email yesterday inviting them to a presentation tomorrow evening at Ridges from 4 to 6 p.m. on feedback from the sector groups.
Yeah, that'll be good. You were going to mention that, were you, Councillor? Thank you. Thank you. Yes, we've had notification of that.
Can I just ask, Madam Chair, are the boards being invited to that? Because we didn't receive an email.
Well, if you haven't, then we'll make sure that that's happened. So, sorry, you should have been advised by now. All right. I've only just seen it, heard it. Sorry, Councillor Kai Fong.
I can arrange that invite to be forwarded to the community boards if that hasn't already been done. So.
No, it hasn't come out then. I must have just heard it. Thank you. Thank you. All right, thank you. Can we move on to our next section? Thank you. Oh, well, we've covered that. We had a big presentation on that, our strategy the other day. Yes, Councillor Maxwell, and
probably key projects.
Yes, so I'd just like to mention on the section on the key projects, I found it so encouraging to see the positive, strong comments from our community towards the key projects, and even commending Council on securing outside funding for the 4 key projects. I thought it was very positive, so I'm right behind that recommendation.
thank you. Thank you. Mrs. Trumper.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to go back to the previous slide, homes and thriving communities. I really would like to emphasise that both Rotorua and Mamaku were also visited, and I know that they, specifically Mamaku, have real aspirations for growth, and I would like to make sure that they're considered in any proposals. I'm well aware that this is a long game, but I don't want to see them, taken out of the equation. I really would like to make sure that they are considered. Thank you.
Thank you. I think the key projects are pretty, thank you, we've all been. Prudent use of debt, thank you. Yes, just waiting for questions, thank you. It has, yes. I think the good thing about the way we've been doing it this morning is things cascade into others. There's always that overlink or interlink, actually. I think that's the better word for it, interlink. So, thank you. Councillor McPherson.
Thank you. Yes, this section of the report I found particularly interesting, and of all the levers that are available to us as a council, this is the one that I believe, this is personally where I've made the greatest shift in my thinking. That is that the debt lever is the one we can make the greatest use of with comparatively less danger to other parts of our strategy. So the flexible use of debt is something that I've come to terms with, and I thank you for your analysis.
Thank you. Oh, thank you. Katapai, thank you. Our next one, thank you very much. Thank you.
Madam Chair, I think we've covered this, and I was interested in the UAG C reduction. That wasn't a very high number of submitters, but that was interesting as a balancing. Do you want to speak to that at all, Thomas?
I'll probably just, again, a reminder to councillors of how it's made up, I guess. So, and if I kind of skip back, 0% general rate increase. We were at 4.7 with regards to the overall increase from the targeted rates, predominantly being driven from the sewerage activity with regards to tied to the proposal, which you're going to make a decision on. As part of the discussion as well with regards to having a 0% general rate increase, took the opportunity to reduce the UAGC. That's something that Council collectively has tried to do for a number of years with regards to becoming more progressive in rates rather than regressive. And so the only substantial change is obviously the fact that you're going to make a decision on the sewerage statement of proposal at the end of July, making sure that the budgets can reflect and accommodate both options. And so therefore, as a result of that, a hybrid of the two budgets for that activity, and that's helped deliver a 4% rather than a 4.7.
Thank you. Jeff, you wanted to make a comment before I...
If I could make one comment, and it's by way of expectation setting. I think if you recall the nature of the strategy, we had the term cushioning the blow, and that's exactly what this rating response is actually all about. I think the Deputy Mayor, during one of the workshops, actually took a line of questioning as to what does this actually mean for the future. And the response to that was that this is by no means will be able to be sustained over a long-term period unless there is some significant changes in service delivery levels provided across the board. So this is all about cushioning the blow. This is not an indication as to a sustainable level of debt increases out into the future, and will need to be readdressed in a discussion around the long-term plan.
Thank you. Mr. Thomas?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and congratulations on getting that down to 4%. I think we all like to see the most favourable rating for our constituents out there and reducing the burden on people. My only concern is I see that has all happened within the waste area, and I'd just like a reassurance that that isn't a reducing our rate of renewals of our, within our sewage schemes, within our networks there. I think that lack of attention to that in perhaps previous decades has been what's put us in this position to start with, that we're needing to spend this money. So I would hope that that whatever result comes out of the proposal on the consortium, that we are still keeping up our level of renewals. Yeah.
I could rewind the tape about 15 minutes and give you that assurance again that the renewal of our infrastructure is a top priority for this organisation. And one of the things we don't do is obviously look, how can we manage a rate increase by managing our renewal spend? That's not something that we do. So.
Councillor Donaldson?
Madam Chair, it was just on the on rating. So I think we've made the decision that the deferment policy will continue throughout the term of this annual plan. Am I right there? And is that funded by debt? And the uptake of those deferment options, has that been more or less than we expected?
So what we're suggesting or recommending is to not have a new deferment option available for the first instalment. So for the fourth instalment being the 20th of May, every ratepayer in our district received information around the deferment option and how they could apply and who it would apply to. And we had an uptake of 100. And obviously we were expecting significantly more. And the quantum of the deferment was $1 million. And we were looking at kind of like a worst case scenario of 10 million. Those people that applied for that post deferment are paying that off over a period of either 6 months or 12 months, which will go into this next financial year. Because of the low uptake, we're not recommending we redo a similar exercise where we send communication out to all ratepayers and set criteria and all the rest. We continue down the path of what we had around the 20th of May, where any ratepayer at any time can make contact with us, talk about their financial circumstances and come to an arrangement with regards to the repayment of their rates during that financial year. And as long as they stick to it, we wipe the penalties off at the end of that. And so that is still available, and our preference is to do it that way rather than a formal process. It means that those existing arrangements that were done for the 20th of May stay in place, and there's no change to those.
Thank you. Look, Thomas, the explanation that you've just given, there will be people now, what you're saying is the deferment is still there, but you're not going to advertise it as you did previously. The reason I'm sort of querying this is that while the uptake was only 100, there will be some people now that are just starting to lose their jobs. And they may not be as, if we're not putting it out there that there is an opportunity to defer the rates, they may not be aware of it. And I'm just saying that I felt it was good when everybody was aware of it. Now I think the landscape is definitely going to change in terms of the numbers who are going to be unemployed. And we're hearing that now coming through.
And I think when
the subsidy goes, when the wage subsidy goes, thank you, Your Worship, yes.
The key there will be the communication that goes with the first rates instalment, ensuring that we encourage those that are facing financial difficulties to make contact with us as and when required, and we'll reinforce that with regards to the communications.
Thank you. Mrs. Trumper?
You, Madam Chair, just a couple of points. First of all, Thomas, I'd like to congratulate you on being able to get the rates down to zero. And the other thing around that was the remissions available for the accommodation sector. That's something that I will acknowledge the Lakes Council provided for farming when we were hit with, really massive increase in rates. So it's a great tool to use. The other thing is, and it's just a little petty thing, is the UAGC. It may only be $25 to those in town, but it actually increases our rural rates on our larger properties by, sometimes up to $500. So, there is and that is a general rise. So I just needed to be a little bit specific about that. The other thing, targeted rates. That's a user pays. And we do need to be mindful that if you use the service, then you need to pay for it. And it doesn't matter who you are or where you are. And the other thing is, and this is probably more to come to the long-term plan, but the economic development levy, which farming picks up as a levy or rate, is Council going to consider giving that or giving any consideration to charging Airbnbs at least the fixed portion of that going forward? It's certainly a subject that has been raised with me a number of times about how Airbnb actually, I suppose, they benefit financially, whereas farmers do not. And so I'm just passing it out there now.
So just a reminder to councillors and community board members in the community that we were undertaking a project pre-COVID with regards to identification of Airbnbs, making contact with them in small batches, and we had a number of them converting to full commercial rates. So where they're over the 100-day threshold, their rates effectively double as a residential property, and that is obviously because it picks up the economic development rate. On top of that, water can move to water by metre, and it also picks up the differential on the general rate. So we were making our way through a list of about 1,000 properties up until COVID. Obviously, though, the world has changed in that element, and I think, needless to say, that discussion on how we rate Airbnbs and booker batches will probably be another cornerstone discussion in the LTP. Yep.
Thank you. Councillor McPherson.
Thank you through you, Chair. A couple of issues that I'm uncertain about. I need to reserve my position on them. First of all, just before I get going on deferrals, I can report feedback from the manufacturing sector of a couple of groups, organisations that have been very appreciative of the flexibility of that scheme. It's really helping them. So thank you for that. But the troubling issue for me is that we've got a 4% increase in rates across the board being proposed. That's in addition to, it's crude, but it's in addition to a 9% fall in GDP for this district, which more or less indicates about a 13% drop in disposable incomes. Now, that severely undermines the case that this is going to equitably impact in a affordability sense on ratepayers. So I need to look hard at that table that you produced today. That looks very interesting indeed. But in the context of something like a 13% drop in disposable incomes, I really have to ask, are there any options that you see possibly to help with the affordability of rates to ratepayers question? Thank you.
I think it's, if I come back to, you mentioned a couple of things. The first one, I guess, was the 9% drop in GDP and what that may look like. The recession and how it falls will not fall even across our community. And if anything, we know that from a Rotorua perspective, that it will fall heavily on tourism-based organisations and hospitality in particular, recognising as well that retail and other businesses will have an impact as well, but not as much. And the strategies have always been to try and cushion the blow, in particular for those sectors as a whole. And I'd imagine with regards to the feedback from those emerging groups and those sector groups and building back Rotorua, obviously there's a good focus on those sorts of elements of it. I think where I struggle is tying the 9% drop in GDP and the rates increase to therefore say that this is an overall decrease to everyone for their disposable income.
I said it was a crude indicator.
Yeah, and even the crudeness of it, I struggle with, and I can't actually respond to that. Ultimately, I think it's up to councillors with regards to their views of what this plan looks to achieve, how it is funded, and the overall comfort that you believe that we're heading in the right direction.
Madam Chair, could I go further? I would suggest that it's probably inappropriate as opposed to crude. I think if we want to talk about impacts on affordability, I think we should probably look to some more robust economic analysis of what that might mean for incomes across families and businesses across the sector. So I suppose I struggle with the idea that crude is in any way useful. I think it's probably more appropriate to say inappropriate.
Through you, Chair, the crudity was an indicator of the fact that I don't have access to those ways of estimating impact. But you do, and it could have been done. But at this stage, that's albeit crude, it is one indicator of approximately the nature of the impact of rates increases of 4% on people also suffering from a drop in GDP. So the work hasn't been done, and I suggest it could yet be done. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that is the unknown. We don't know people's personal situations. We do know that there's been an impact, and we are following things through, I'm sure, with WINS and also with our various groups, just to see what that impact is. But I think there's some assumptions being made there, and it's a very difficult thing to realise. Your Worship.
Yes. Look, my question is, how do we let the accommodation providers know of this? I think that's magnificent. I hear from the sector, especially with where the impact is going, that very tough for them at the moment. The tap was turned off overnight, really, and we don't know when it's going to be turned on fully, and domestic tourism is not going to fill it. So I think that will be a huge relief to them, softening the blow, and I hope when it comes out, they're communicated as well about to whom it applies and how the criteria is put across for them.
Thank you.
Plan charges, yeah.
Thank you, Your Worship. Councillor Maxwell, then Councillor Wang.
Thank you, Chair. At the public evening here in the chamber last week, I was in the group, the Taraweta's group, and a lot of people have sent in submissions or their names towards the submissions. Is this the appropriate time? I do have a couple of questions that came up there that they could help. Is this the right place?
We will come to Tarawera shortly, if you want to save your questions, Councillor.
Kia ora, thank you, Madam Chair. I just had a question regarding in the 4% overall targeted rates, in the breakdown of it for waste management, there was a slight increase, and regarding the loss of revenue for the recyclables, was that due to the overseas market refusing our recyclables, or was that due to level 4 and we couldn't do it because of the health and safety regulations around that? And if that is the case, that the overseas market's refusing, then we're having to cover the costs for it. If it is an ongoing thing, and what can we do to, I guess, navigate around, other avenues of reducing the cost and processing our own recyclables?
Yeah, it was an issue pre-COVID, and it's tied to the fact that some of the countries, in particular, I think China stopped taking, and I think Malaysia and a couple of the others as well. Needless to say, I think central government has already identified it as a significant issue, and they're investigating, I think, options around how to deal with that. And from memory, Stavros and his team are working with them. Obviously, it's a New Zealand Inc. problem. It's not one that we will resolve ourselves.
Councillor. Oh, Councillor Kai Fong, sorry.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a question around the recommendation for the proposed rates relief. So obviously one is monitoring the conditions and then offering deferment. But the second one where you mentioned remission, so that's capped at 100K, is that right? I made a note.
Yeah, we're just still crunching the numbers as to what it will take to soften that. So that sector as a whole is getting about a $250,000 rate increase, and so we think somewhere in the $50,000 to $100,000 mark is what will be required to soften that rate increase for that sector. So no more than 100,000, and we'll hope to have that detail back to you by the time we adopt the annual plan.
So as another possible strategy, because if it's a remission, that means we lose that income forever.
Yep.
And that's going to be funded from borrowing?
We believe that we can make it fit within the existing budget for remissions across the wider rates revenue. So we have a budget set aside for the amount of remissions we apply across the board for all our remission policies, and we believe that that can be soaked up into that budget for next year.
Okay, so just one other question would be, is a longer deferment a more preferable option rather than a remission, so that we at least, because we don't know what the future may hold, and if the accommodation sector does recover, then we've got the opportunity to recover that rather than simply remitting or writing it off right now?
I think the sector as a whole will probably struggle to repay, and as what we saw is actually a number of the hotels and motels chose not to do the deferment because they recognised that deferring the rates just meant that they eventually had to pay it. The other one is the increase to that sector is predominantly being driven. Well, there's two things. One, the UAGC change. Those high capital value hotels are seeing a shift in the general rate. But predominantly the most of the increase is actually driven from the sewage charges. So with the sewage rate being proposed to go up to the way that it is, hotels and motels in particular, you can pretty much break their rates down to a third general rate, a third economic development rate, and a third sewage. And so what you're seeing therefore is that increase to the sewage rate is predominantly driving the increase in these cases. And I think with regards to the upcoming discussions in the long-term plan, and we kind of signalled it in the annual plan workshops, how we fund sewage and the appropriateness of the PAN charges will probably be a discussion point in the LTP. And I think therefore that would probably be the mechanism of addressing it in the longer term with regards to who pays.
Thank you. Thank you. Can we move on to our next section? Thank you. Oh, no. No, I didn't have...
Just on that one,
sorry.
Madam Chair, just following on from that discussion, and perhaps it's a question for either JP or the Chief Executive, I think that remission for the accommodation sector is a key point in building confidence in that sector. They're really exposed right now, and there are a number of developments that are mothballed. So I think it's a key sector that needs to see, to build confidence in.
Certainly hard hit, absolutely. And the opportunity to bounce back is not going to happen overnight.
I just signalled to the council that what we're seeing in those accommodation numbers with the rates increases is the increases are quite diverse. And they're diverse because of the unique nature of each of those properties. High capital value, low capital value, the number of units versus not PANs. And so we're not going to do a universal remission. What we are looking to do is provide a targeted remission to those in the higher end of the bracket to soften it, not across the board. So be very clear on that one.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for that.
By far the most submitters. I'll leave it there for questions.
I think we've had a lot, we've had quite a lot of discussion, but I know that there are some questions. Councillor Wang.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Well, just one question I had regarding, it was one of the concerns that the community had, and through the feedback was the central government funding of $6.5 million and how that could potentially be lost by the deferral, sorry, not deferral, I mean, how do I word this? The postponement really. Would that be lost with the current program that we're considering, or the recommendation?
No. So I think with Rotorua Rotorua, we experienced, I think, similar feedback. And there was always a risk that if you take too long, that the funding would be pulled. The infrastructure team in particular, and I think the Regional Council and MFE meet on a regular basis, on a quarterly basis, to talk about these sorts of projects. And so we're in constant discussion with government agencies with regards to the progress. And I think there's been no indication for them to signal that we're not moving fast enough and need to move faster. And rest assured that I guess if the pathway is ahead of us on the slide, that if that pathway changes and the government agencies weren't supportive of that, then they would start having discussions with us, obviously, around that. But at this moment, we're not aware of anything.
Mr. Thomas?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And yes, we got an awful lot of submissions on this, and I think we should all see that positively, that we have at least one community that pays attention to the information we put out from our meetings and forums. So great to see that they watch what we're up to. Look, I just want to say that, I've been involved in a lot of our sewage schemes now, and this is a huge level of feedback from that community. But I'd also like to point out a lot of feedback in support of that scheme from our partners such as Regional Council and Te Aroha Lakes Trust, who are our partners in protecting water quality in our area and who we've been working with in a very collaborative role for a couple of decades now. So it's good to see that there's wider community support as well. I noticed Lakes Water Quality Society was in there, as well as a number of Rotorua residents as well. I think that there is a real fear in that community of not just a short delay, but a major delay, if it was pushed out to not happening until a delayed wastewater treatment plant in town went through. And what I noticed that in your presentation and the recommendations in here differ slightly, but I would like to ask that we just, as a council, reconfirm our commitment to wastewater at Tarawera. And I'd be suggesting that while we recognise the need to complete our consultation with iwi, that we're committed to helping protect and improve water quality at Lake Tarawera by implementing a sewerage scheme as per the timeline outlined in the 2018-28 LTP. And I do realise that will come up for consultation again next year, and I'm sure Tarawera residents will be making sure we're aware of their opinion then as well. But I think at this stage, I would like to see us just reconfirming that at the moment we're still working along the grounds of the current LTP.
I think that is a discussion that will definitely come up in the LTP, but there is an opportunity through the letters that get sent back to the submitters that that's possibly an opportunity to allay any further concern that's obviously been expressed by the number of submitters that we are still committed to doing that. That might be something that do I sign off on those letters? I think I do. Oh well, there you go.
Yes, and thank you, Madam Chair.
I'll work with Una on that.
Yeah.
And you're right. Anything
Yes.
that we can do to allay concern. And,
yes, I think that's all they're looking for, is that the process isn't going to be stretched out by another 5 or 8 years. I think they're wanting to know that progress is travelling along on the path that it should. And I do know from experience that people get very frustrated at this point in the projects when you're still finalising the details before you start work on it, and that people do need that reassurance that the work is continuing.
Thank you. Councillor Maxwell.
Thank you, Chair. Actually, Councillor Wang asked one of the questions that I had. That was on the 6.5 million that funding from Ministry of Environment. The second one came from You've got it up there about finalising the cultural impact assessment. Now, they said they already had one done. Is this the second one that they're awaiting on, please?
So my words there are not technically correct. So if Stavros was sitting here, he would say that the cultural impact assessment has been completed, but what it has highlighted is a need for us to talk to iwi partners out there in particular, and that's what's currently taking place to understand fully their views before we can progress, and we hope to have that completed by September 2020.
So that when we do get a cultural impact assessment, it is actually one that's been fully supported. Thank you. And I do appreciate that normally they would put that out to consult and with, as you say, with yourselves and others, so that we're all on. What we do get is the one that will be supported. Councillor McPherson.
Thank you. I'd endorse much of what's been said already about this issue. I noticed that the working towards completing that cultural impact assessment, which was due 18 months ago, then it almost implies that work will then commence on detailed design. I recall attending some briefings by, it was Greg Massaro, where the detailed design of the system itself being proposed was pretty advanced. My hope would be that the cultural impact assessment work and the detailed design that's still got to be done, they can run in parallel. They're not sequenced, are they?
Well, they sort of are, because our partners in iwi's desires and wishes may not be aligned to said design, and so therefore it's important to get that view right, so then you can progress the final design for, obviously, community consultation and a council decision.
Yeah, my concern would be that might be another source of delay, which would create greater uncertainty.
But unfortunately, as we've learned through the Rotorua scheme, while it may be an unfortunate delay, it actually is an incredibly important thing we need to do to ensure that it gets done right.
Not only the delay, but can prove extremely costly. Yes, thank you. Thank you. So thank you very much for that one. Right.
So with that, I think back to the formal agenda now.
Thank you. Yes, Your Worship. I'll just take any further comments.
Oh, not comments. I just wish to signal that I support 2.2.
Oh, thank you.
That the committee recommend to council to proceed with the adoption of the annual plan in line with the 8 strategies and proposals outlined in the information engagement document. I move.
I'll second.
Oh. Thank you. So who did second in the end? Mrs. Trumper, thank you. Thank you. So it has been moved and seconded. Before I put that recommendation, are there any further comments? Thank you.
Can someone please define what to proceed towards means? Thank you.
That will be, that towards means the council on Thursday.
Yes, so from this resolution, councillors, we will look to finalise the annual plan for adoption on the 9th of July, and also set the rates. So we will begin the process of finalising the agenda, the recommendations, the annual plan in light with the recommendations that you saw, and get ready to strike the rates as well.
Thank you. Jeff, before I put that motion, I just wondered if you'd like to, anything you'd like to add to that? All right. Thank you. Yes, Your Worship.
I'd like to congratulate the team that's listened, that held the workshops, held the evenings that we attended, has listened and has changed. And I think it will give our community greater confidence in a very uncertain time. We haven't got it signed off yet, but thank you for taking into account the wider impacts, the emerging management of risk, but also our ability to adapt and be flexible, and also cushioning the blow for those that are really feeling it at the moment out in our community. I'm very proud of this position. And it's taken some iteration to move through to get to this. And it's incredible that we started it in lockdown. And we started the process really by Zooming. And it shows that we can work quite flexibly and quite differently. So we were quite innovative in that approach too. I'm glad it's got to this stage, and I'm very proud of you all for what you've managed to put together. Thank you.
Yeah.
To Madam Chair, support all the comments that made, and job well done by the team. But can I ask a question through to Una? The big night that we had a lot of people here, there must have been a good reason, but was there an error in having both presentations on the same evening, or what happened there?
Timing.
Councillor Maxwell, I think what that just shows is that there was a very passionate group of people out at Rotorua. That was the night that they were available to come, and they had obviously decided to come en masse together. Unfortunately, they were coming along when we, at the same time, were running a session, an information session on the wastewater services. So we had a lot of people all wanting to see Stavros and talk to Stavros. In future, we will probably not run sessions of different conversations on the same night, so that we don't run into that same situation again. Thank you.
Yeah, and Madam Chair, can I add tautoko, the effort by Stavros to stay an extra hour while that group was heard at the end of his feedback session. So they did get their hearing, and they did get an extra hour to have question and answer on the Tarawera scheme with Stavros. And I know recently in the project steering group that Mr. Thomas and I sit on, that continued communication with the Tarawera community is planned.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much. And I think, Your Worship, you have said it. You've thanked the team who put the hard work and hard yards into developing the plan for us. But I think also a big thank you must go to our citizens, those who have submitted verbally, those who have submitted in written form or got back to us in one way, shape or form, because they do underpin their submissions, help us in the decisions that we have to make. So it was very, very good to get that feedback from our citizens. And also, of course, to the extra work that the staff had to put in through, of course, the impacts of COVID, and having to sit there and try to look into a crystal ball and anticipate what's coming over the horizon for us, or what's there in that crystal ball that might help us again to fine-tune and make ourselves somewhat more flexible as we go forward from this. So I want to thank everybody for their input into our deliberations. And you have one final comment, do you, Mr. Thomas?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And look, it was just a comment around the what we used to call the World Cafe style of engagement, because I did hear a few people complain about that and saying that there should be public hearings here when they're sitting in front of the council. I've got to say, having been involved in every form of consultation that this council has ever done, that actually we see a really good range of people coming into those World Cafe style situations, people who we would have never have seen coming and presenting to us in a formal manner. So I think they're really worthwhile. They always require work and development, but I think it was a great innovation of this council to go down that track a few years ago.
Thank you. Well, we've had a mover and a seconder that the committee recommend to council to proceed towards adoption of the annual plan in line with the 8 strategies and proposals outlined in the information engagement document. It's been moved and seconded. I'll put that motion. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Contrary? Thank you. Carried. Oh, you want to abstain? Abstain. Thank you. So that's Councillor McPherson abstained. Thank you. Now, I think that's the conclusion of our meeting. That's the conclusion of our meeting. So now, do I need to? Oh, yes. Well, I declare, because it is a hearing. Thank you. Yes, I declare our meeting closed. Thank you very much. Kia ora. Do we have any lunch or any? Yes. Oh, there is some lunch being provided. Thank you. Kia ora, and thank you everyone for your attendance.